In November 1869, a French empress sat on a gilded ship in the Egyptian desert and waited for a canal to open. The canal was not yet finished at the point she boarded. Workers were still clearing sand from the final stretches just hours before the ceremony began. That detail, the gap between spectacle and engineering reality, runs all the way through the Suez Canal story. The Suez Canal connects the Mediterranean Sea at Port Said in the north to the Red Sea at Suez in the south. The distance is roughly 193 kilometers through flat Egyptian desert, salt lakes, and ancient waterlogged terrain. Before it opened, a ship traveling from London to Bombay had no choice but to sail around the entire African continent. That meant rounding the Cape of Good Hope, adding somewhere between 6,000 and 7,000 nautical miles to the journey. In the age of sail, time was wind-dependent. In the early age of steam, time was fuel and money. The canal did not just shorten a route. It restructured the economics of what could be shipped profitably where. But building it took nearly 11 years, cost far more than projected, and broke the finances of the country that hosted it. The idea of cutting a canal through the Isthmus of Suez was ancient. Pharaonic Egypt had smaller waterways, connecting parts of this region to the Nile and the Red Sea centuries before the Common Era. Napoleon's engineers surveyed the isthmus in 1798. They concluded incorrectly that the two seas sat at different elevations. That calculation error delayed European interest in a proper canal by roughly half a century. By the 1850s, a French diplomat named Ferdinand de Lesseps had obtained a concession from the Egyptian Khedive Said Pasha. De Lesseps was not an engineer. He was a negotiator, a promoter, and by most accounts, an exceptionally persuasive man. The concession gave the newly formed Suez Canal Company the right to build and operate the canal for 99 years. Egypt would receive 15% of the profits. France and international shareholders would hold the rest. The Ottoman Empire, which nominally controlled Egypt, objected. Britain objected more loudly. Britain, at this point, dominated global seaborne trade. A French-controlled canal through the Egyptian desert struck London as a direct threat. The British government lobbied against the project, applied diplomatic pressure, and privately expected it to collapse. It did not collapse. Construction began in April 1859 at the Mediterranean end, near what would become Port Said. The initial labor conditions were harsh. Egyptian peasant workers, known as corvée laborers, were conscripted in large numbers. This was forced labor in practice, organized through the Khedive's government, and tens of thousands of men were cycled through the construction sites at various periods. International pressure, partly from Britain, partly from rising internal opposition, eventually curtailed the large-scale use of corvée labor in the early 1860s. The company then shifted toward paid labor and, critically, toward machinery. Steam-powered dredges were imported from Europe and became the dominant tool for excavating the canal through the low-lying sections near the Salt Lakes. The engineering challenge was not depth. The canal runs through flat terrain with no locks required. Unlike Panama, the challenge was volume. Moving tens of millions of cubic meters of sand and sediment with the technology of the 1860s was a logistical problem, as much as a mechanical one. Costs ballooned steadily throughout the decade of construction. The original estimate was roughly 200 million francs. The final cost came closer to 400 to 450 million, depending on how the accounting was structured. Egypt bore a significant portion of this burden, partly through the labor arrangements and partly through additional loans and financial obligations the Khedive took on to fund the project. Said Pasha died in 1863, before the canal opened. His successor, Ismail Pasha, continued the project but inherited the financial entanglement that came with it. The canal opened on November 17, 1869, with a ceremony that was, by the standards of the time, spectacular. Empress Eugenie of France attended on her imperial yacht. Delegations arrived from dozens of countries. Fireworks over the desert, banquets lasting days. The British government sent no official representative. The British press, however, was paying close attention. The first ship to transit the full canal in commercial service was not a grand ocean liner. It was a modest vessel carrying ordinary cargo, which is perhaps the more honest symbol of what the canal actually was. Not a monument. A shortcut with a toll booth. Within a few years of opening, the canal was handling a volume of traffic that surprised even its promoters. In 1870, around 500 ships passed through. By 1880, that number had climbed past 2,000 annually. The ships were almost entirely steam-powered. Sailing vessels struggled with the canal's narrow width and the absence of reliable wind in the corridor. This gave steam shipping a decisive commercial advantage it had been building toward for decades, but had not yet fully secured. The canal effectively accelerated the end of the age of sail for long-distance cargo trade. Meanwhile, Egypt was financially collapsing. Ismail Pasha had borrowed heavily, not just for the canal, but for railways, telegraphs, cotton infrastructure, and a modernization program that outpaced Egyptian revenues. The American Civil War had briefly made Egyptian cotton extremely valuable. When American production recovered after 1865, Egyptian cotton revenues fell sharply. By 1875, Ismail was so desperate for cash that he sold Egypt's shares in the Suez Canal Company to the British government. The price was roughly £4 million sterling, negotiated in days, financed through the London banking house of Rothschild. Britain, which had opposed the canal's construction at nearly every stage, now owned 44% of it. The irony was not lost on observers at the time. Ismail was formally deposed in 1879 under pressure from European creditors and the Ottoman Sultan. By 1882, Britain had militarily occupied Egypt, citing the need to protect its canal interests and stabilize the country's finances. The canal that Egypt had built on Egyptian soil and that had cost Egypt its financial independence was now guarded by British troops. This sequence, concession, debt, foreign intervention, occupation, became a pattern repeated elsewhere across the colonial world in the late 19th century. It was not an accident, it was a structure. For Britain, the canal transformed imperial logistics in ways that took full effect only gradually. The journey from Britain to India dropped from roughly 24 days around the Cape to somewhere between 12 and 15 days through the canal, depending on the ship. Troops could be moved faster, mail arrived faster, cotton and tea and grain moved faster. The canal tightened the administrative grip of empire on its most distant territories. It also shifted the geography of strategic anxiety. Whoever controlled the canal controlled the artery. France, Russia, and later Germany all watched British dominance over the canal route with varying degrees of alarm. The canal appeared repeatedly in diplomatic calculations for the rest of the 19th century and well into the 20th. During both World Wars, it was a military objective of the First Order. In 1956, Egyptian President Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the canal, declaring that revenues from it would fund the Aswan High Dam. Britain, France, and Israel launched a military operation to retake it. The United States, under Eisenhower, opposed the operation. Under American and Soviet pressure, the three powers withdrew. The Suez Crisis of 1956 is widely considered the moment that formally ended British and French claims to independent great power status. A canal built partly to extend European influence over Asia had become the instrument of Europe's strategic humiliation. Egypt has operated the canal ever since. Today, the Suez Canal handles roughly 12 to 15% of global trade by volume, depending on the year and how disruptions are measured. Container ships, oil tankers, and bulk carriers pass through and manage convoys. The system largely unchanged in principle from the original design. The canal has been widened and deepened multiple times. A parallel channel was added in 2015 to increase capacity and allow two-way traffic in certain sections. In March 2021, a container ship called the Ever Given ran aground in the canal and blocked it for 6 days. An estimated 369 ships were backed up waiting. Analysts calculated the disruption at roughly $9 billion per day in delayed trade. 6 days, $9 billion per day. That is what the canal is now worth to the system built around it. De Lesseps, who died in 1894 having watched his later Panama Canal project collapse in scandal and criminal charges, did not live to see this version of his canal. He probably would not have been surprised by any of it. Not the geopolitics, not the debt, and certainly not the spectacle. As with most things in this story, the details shift slightly depending on which archive you consult, which government's records you trust, and how the canal's economic effects are being measured and by whom. What does not shift is the basic shape of it. A 193-kilometer trench that rerouted global trade, bankrupted the country that built it, and is still running.